We're here in Singapore at the Shangri-la Dialogue, which is Asia's main security conference, and it's taking place at a time of incredibly great tension around the world. We have major wars in Europe, in the Middle East, and here in Asia there are increasing concerns that this region could be headed to a serious conflict as well. I'm talking here to Bastian Giegerich. He's the Director General of the IISS, that's the think tank that hosts this conference. Thanks for talking to DW, Dr. Giegerich. So let's just start off by the starting point here in Asia. You've just released a report that talks about a draining decade in the increasingly tense relationship between the United States and China vying for primacy in this region. How serious are these dangers? Do people need to think about the possibility that there could be a war in Asia in the next 1 or 2 decades?
Well, I think the key point is to acknowledge that tensions have really intensified, and that happens in the context of strategic competition between the US and China. And I think the element that is new is that it has that is encompassing now all areas of policy making: security, economics, diplomacy, trade, and so you see the pressure on countries in the region to decide how they want to align, increase. You see at the same time it becoming harder for these countries to balance their choices. You know, if they're intensifying their security relationships with the United States, their space to work with China diminishes, and vice versa. So that is difficult to manage. I wouldn't say there's we're not on a deterministic path to conflict. I think that is wrong, but it's certainly true that these tensions are intensifying, and of course they're intensifying at a time when we see war in Europe, we see war in the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific is the third region that makes the geopolitical weather. So this is all rather important.
So, I mean, what you described there, I mean, a lot of people are already using the term a new Cold War to describe the tensions and these kind of groupings that you described, that there's a pull, the Chinese trying to pull countries into its orbit, the United States trying to do the same thing. When we stand back and look at, what is the underlying structural conflict between the United States and China, how would you describe it? What is it that China wants that the United States does not want to permit it?
Well, I think a lot of countries here in the region will fear that maybe while some actors talk about their desire for a multipolar world, we might be heading to a unipolar Asia, and that is a thought that makes people uncomfortable. So I think a lot of the underlying tensions are about primacy in the region, and I think the question that people are asking is this a tension and a competition for primacy within a system? Or is this about changing the system that we're operating in? And you will have heard over the last couple of years a lot of talk about the rules-based order and the rules-based international order, and that has been increasingly challenged over the last couple of years. And I think we're seeing a moment where the institutions that have been set up to manage those risks and manage those challenges, including here in the region, have come under increasing strain and are maybe hitting the limits of their ability to deliver outcomes that countries are comfortable with. So one question for decision makers here in the region is which ones of these fora to invest in, what mechanisms to use, and you see a proliferation of partnerships, bilateral, trilateral, minilateral, that all are an expression of that difficulty and of that challenge.
And you hear from the Russians and to some extent also from the Chinese that this notion of a rules-based international order is hollow and self-serving, that it was really, these rules set up by the United States to serve its own interests. What would you say to that? And from the United States point of view, they see China as essentially trying to tell it, get out of our backyard. Is it more a territorial thing than a thing about rules?
Well, I think rules are important because they provide the framework in which prosperity and security are created. And those who are challenging these rules, the question to them is, do you have an alternative on offer, or are you just pulling things down, are you just undermining things? And I think that is a legitimate question to ask those who are criticizing the rules that do exist. But we do have to acknowledge that we live in a time where a lot of these rules get broken, and that, again, is something that reaches across regions. Euro-Atlantic area into the Middle East and into this region. And I think that is probably the background against which a lot of these conversations take place now.
I mean, there are two flashpoints in this region that are often talked about, South China Sea and Taiwan. Which of those gives you most concern?
Well, I think what concerns me is perhaps not so much the prospect of war as a deliberate choice of policy. I think that is a low prospect. But what concerns me are the many movements and activities short of armed conflict and war that can still have a very destabilizing effect. All these activities in the gray zone, some of them are maritime security activities, some of them are maritime security activities related to Taiwan. So I think that is an area that can create quite significant effects, that can create instability. And I think a broader question there is whether any of these activities could lead to miscalculation and accidental escalation. I think that is something that I would worry about quite a lot. I think war as a deliberate choice of policy, that's still a very low probability.
The Americans are pushing hard for more military-to-military dialogue, which has been resuming between the US and China. The US and Chinese defense ministers are going to have a rare meeting here in Singapore on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue. How important is that? Or is the underlying problem actually just deeper than anything that kind of dialogue can resolve?
I think that direct dialogue is very important, actually. If we have a bilateral meeting here between the US Secretary of Defense Austin and the Chinese Defense Minister Admiral Dong, that will be the first face-to-face meeting in about nearly 2 years. And it is important for decision makers to meet, to clarify their positions, to explain their positions. That in itself is a measure of transparency. It's a measure that helps prevent misunderstandings and miscalculations. It's a measure that can lead to some form of cooperation, and that's really what we hope for here at the ISS Shangri-La Dialogue. That's the purpose of what we're trying to do here, to encourage that. So we're very pleased. We will be very pleased when this happens, if this happens. And we do think these military-to-military contacts are quite important. They reduce the room for error at a time when there are more and more military encounters. And in that context, it is important to have channels of communications, direct channels of communications. By themselves, they're not enough, but they're an important element.
Final question. There's something of an elephant in the room, which is the prospect of a second Trump presidency in the United States. There's great anxiety in Europe about what that could mean for the Ukraine conflict, for handling the threat of Vladimir Putin. What could that mean for this region?
Well, I wouldn't want to predict the outcomes of the US elections in November. We will have to wait and see. I think here the view is that, for example, with regards to the US position on China, it is actually a position that is that doesn't vary that much across the two political camps in the United States. So perhaps that on that dimension there will be a consensus that will be stable, independent of that outcome. So I think the worry that you alluded to is probably larger in Europe than it is here.
Bastian Giegerich, thanks for talking to DW today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.